Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's Castle Report. This is Friday, the 24th day of April, and this, the year of our Lord 2026. My beat is war once again. War against Iran and the efforts to keep the Strait of Hormuz open for the commerce of the world, along with the unexpected results being felt around the world as a result of this war. Let me start with a brief refresher or a brief reminder regarding the history of the U.S. war with Iran before I get into unexpected results of the war. The U.S. government, back in 1953, started this long conflict by its overthrow of Mosaddegh, who was popularly elected, and his replacement with the Shah, who was always seen as a U.S. puppet. If what I just said is true, and I obviously believe that it is, then the U.S. has been in this conflict for 73 years. In 1953, the Korean War was just shutting down, so maybe a new conflict was needed in the Middle East to feed the war machine, but who knows? Fast forward to today, we find that often history does repeat itself, but barely is it noticed because it will always be different this time. We have lots of propaganda coming out of the war from both sides. Unlike the propaganda in earlier wars, today's propaganda reaches the whole world instantly through social media. In the world wars, for example, propaganda was designed only for the home populations for each side. They told the people, don't worry, we're winning. Just hang in there, folks. Except for the Tokyo Rose broadcast to the U.S. Navy and the Axis Sally broadcast to the U.S. bomber crews, the propaganda was primarily to keep the population's backs in the war effort. To that end, the ceasefire is announced from time to time, and that mere announcement will usually calm the headlines and calm the markets for a brief time. The other side quickly violates the ceasefire or denies that it even exists. The whole thing starts over. President Trump says they have agreed to everything. The Iranians say, no, we haven't. We're going to keep our uranium, and the strait remains closed. It appears to be just propaganda back and forth, or perhaps just wishful thinking. The confusion is exasperated by Iran's lack of known leadership. Who are we talking to from day to day? We do know a few things that appear to be factual, however. 6 or 7 weeks ago, the U.S. and Israel launched a preemptive attack, a surprise attack, a sneak attack, depending on your point of view. This attack was launched in the midst of negotiations a la Pearl Harbor. When the Japanese did it, they thought and hoped it would demoralize the American people into negotiations favorable to Japan, but it had the opposite effect, and I submit this attack did the same to Iran. The U.S. dropped unprecedented amounts of bombs and missiles on Korea and Vietnam, but neither surrendered. That fact of history seems to have gone unnoticed by this administration. The Iranians believe they are the victims of an unprovoked attack which cost them dearly in terms of lives, treasure, infrastructure. They think they are entitled to compensation for that. I submit that one way or another they will get it. In the meantime, the war is actually helping Iran by raising oil prices worldwide, thus helping the Iranian export prices. They could insist on tolls to the Strait of Hormuz, which they'd never done before this war started. I suspect that no permanent peace agreement will happen without compensation from the U.S. and or Israel. Either way, it would be on the backs of the U.S. taxpayers. My guess is that this war will continue for a time that we could call indefinite continuance, in other words. And here is one reason why Trump apparently started this war at the behest of Netanyahu, but now he aggressively insults and attacks anyone he perceives to have said a negative word about him, and that includes foreign leaders. He doesn't seem to understand that people remember the insults. They remember these things. And foreign affairs of a great nation can't be conducted like kids jostling each other on a school playground. The problem of war in the Middle East is more than likely unsolvable as long as Israel exists, especially with its current leadership. Therefore, expect to be at war for a long time, at least until it finally destroys the U.S. economy. Speaking of the U.S. and the world economy, let's look at some results of this war, or at least some things made worse by it. This all comes at a time when rising debt levels across all forms of government and personal life, rising interest obligations are pushing the U.S. into a more fragile state economically. According to Money Week, U.S. debt has now exceeded $39 trillion. It's been only 5 months since it blew past $38 trillion. The debt has doubled since Trump was sworn in for his first term, or in about 10 years. No amount of bluster and bombast will erase certain facts as the U.S. approaches $40 trillion amid rising interest rates, along with a coming debt crisis. The U.S. has about $9 trillion of debt that must be refinanced or rolled over this year. Presumably, short-term treasuries can be sold at about 3.5%, but what if they can't be sold at 3.5%? What if it takes 5% to sell them? That would be catastrophic. It would accelerate the crash to an unstoppable speed. I admit I'm no economist, but that's the way it looks to me from the numbers I see. The disturbing thing is that Washington seems to take no notice of it, no notice at all. This fiscal year 2026, the defense budget, or the war budget as it's now called, is about $950 billion. Trump has requested an amount 60% increase to $1.5 trillion for fiscal year 2027. That's all caused by the war in Iran, right? Well, no, folks, I'm afraid not, because that doesn't even include the cost of the Iranian war. So he's saying to us, we need a 60% increase just to keep up. The U.S. has dropped tens of thousands of bombs and missiles on Iran, has lost a few aircraft, along with great damage to bases all over the Middle East. The U.S. has had to move its military out of the Persian Gulf region, move its carriers at least 1,000 kilometers, or about 620 miles, from the conflict to avoid missile attacks. So one unexpected result of this war is that the U.S. multi-billion-dollar carriers are very vulnerable to cheap drone and missile attacks. Iran apparently has quite a stockpile of those, and reportedly China is resupplying them all the time. Iran has an ace up its sleeve in this war. This international poker game of death, and that ace is the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is a narrow strip of water that links the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. Before the war started, approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day, or about 20% of the entire global production, passed through the strait, along with 20% of global liquid natural gas exports, according to U.S. Energy Information Administration. The strait is so vitally important to the world economy that it's a fair guess that disruption for a prolonged period would provoke a worldwide depression. Iran has spent decades accumulating the means to do just that, to shut down the strait. It has commanding geography, 1,000 miles of coastline, many inlets where missiles can be stored and launched. The U.S. has discovered that even the U.S. Navy cannot police all 1,000 miles. Just this week, reportedly 24 Iranian tankers slipped through the U.S. blockade. If the strait is not completely closed, it's too dangerous for normal commercial shipping. Oil and natural gas are everywhere and in everything in this world. They are the most important of all commodities. The world depends on them. The Far East today is the manufacturing center of the world, or the world's workshop. The Middle East oil and gas keeps the Far East workshop working. Until this war is resolved, we can probably count on oil above $100 per barrel, increasing shortages of many of the things we used to have in abundance. Ultimately, the real danger is worldwide food production and the increasing cost of food caused by ever lower crop yields. The threat to the world's food supply is being caused by the drastic reduction in fertilizer, because so much of the fertilizer is shipped through the Gulf. The world needs fertilizer to grow crops to feed people. That is gradually being strangled. Once again, one of the unexpected results of war. Perhaps the markets of the world have just been waiting for a pin to come along and pop the bubble. So we will see that higher prices for fuel will result in higher prices for everything. That is as inevitable as night follows day. The result of all this and the result of the war will be a significantly lower standard of living for the people of the world. So propaganda tells us the strait will remain open. The mullahs will never have a nuclear weapon. Neither statement appears to be true at the current time, so that leaves the U.S. in a very difficult position. The U.S. could just admit defeat and leave, thus admitting the empire cannot fulfill its promises any longer. Or the U.S. could also resort to the unthinkable, but I don't see many other choices. In any event, the petrodollar world appears to be ending. I heard Marco Rubio, the Secretary of Everything, say the other day that Brazil, the largest country in South America, just concluded a deal with China to trade in the Chinese currency. The U.S. relies on the dollar as the world's reserve to bully and sanction other countries, but if they are not trading in the dollar, then sanctions are no threat. So the world is changing rapidly, not in favor of the American people, or at least that's my take on it, folks. Donald Trump has hung an albatross around his neck, and removing it is job number one. He might have to allow a strategic retreat to a more defensible line. The failure to reach that conclusion has resulted in the destruction of many armies throughout history, the loss of many wars throughout history. So, admit it was a mistake. Find some way to reverse the course, no matter what Israel says about it. That's my advice. The longer he persists, the worse it will get, because he simply is not all-powerful like he apparently thought he was. Neither is the United States. Finally, folks, I hope this was just a tragic mistake, not something pre-planned for a far more sinister reason. But the unexpected results of it are apparently only unexpected by us normal people who are concerned about working, living, raising our kids in a peaceful world. At least that's the way I see it. Till next time, folks, this is Darrell Castle. Thanks for listening.